behalf of the director Susan Weber and my faculty colleagues, I welcome you at the Bard Graduate Center. I thank you for joining us here tonight, whether you're ventured here to 86th Street or tuned in online through BGC TV. Bard Graduate Center respectively acknowledges our presence in Lenape-Hocking, the ancestral homeland of the Lenni Lenape, and recognizes New York City as a past, present, and future crossroads for many indigenous people. And this is the second lecture in the inaugural series of the Archeological Encounter Seminar at BGC. And if you've followed our previous... Good. Can you use the microphone better? Sure. Good. If you've followed our previous first lecture, you will have noticed that my co-organizer Meredith Lynn and I decided to celebrate this new fixture not just with a cautious sprinkle of material culture, but with a decisive foray into current theoretical debate. We sort of discussed possible themes and foci for our lectures. We thought that one key shift which really encapsulates recent disciplinary trends came to the fore in the substitution of personhood for identity as a mode for conceiving or of conceiving relationships between humans and things. So material culture is increasingly thought not to passively reflect a person or who a person is in society, but to embody or constitute that person in more intrinsic ways. We didn't set any kind of restrictive brief when we spoke to our invited speakers. We wanted to sort of productively bounce different perspectives off each other. And the first one of those you've heard in October, Zoe Crossland's incisive, really excellent presentation on the ontological status of the body as material culture or as material evidence in forensic investigations. And I think today's speaker, all the way from the Netherlands, is likely to delve much, much deeper into the past. So David Fontijn is a professor in the archaeology of early Europe at the University of Leiden and director of the formidable director of research at his institution's Faculty of Archaeology. His area of specialization is the early agrarian societies of Europe from the prehistory to the early historical period, and I think within that very long period, especially those of the Bronze Age and the early Iron Age. He's particularly known for his work on the articulation of cultural landscapes through the exchange and deposition of objects. He's also in that field principal investigator of currently actually a major 5-year project in this field called Economies of Destruction, which deals with that very perplexing phenomenon of persistent and large-scale destruction of valuable objects. And we'll hear more about this tonight. And I think this is astonishingly, it's really only the latest of a long series of such collaborative projects funded by the Netherlands Organization for Scientific Research, also Germany's Excellence Cluster Topoi. Others dealt with daily life in the Stone Age, but also elite boroughs and their precedents in the Netherlands and Germany. Personally, I know David Fontijn from conferences appearances and his publications as an exceptionally generous guide to European prehistory. His work provides time and again reminders of how high-level analytical explanation can and really should go hand in hand with a close-up study of objects and contexts. And a prime example of this is his book, his 2002 book, Sacrificial Landscapes, Cultural Biographies of Persons, Objects and Natural Places in the Bronze Age, which integrates a very considerable corpus of previously unpublished metalwork with really still fundamental discussions of such broad concepts as ritual or structured deposition and object biography. More recently, his research projects have resulted in lots of edited volumes. I think also I would like to mention here some of his shorter contributions to book sections, which are really excellent resources for teaching. I might mention here his piece on local elites globalized in death in the recent Routledge Handbook on the Archaeology of Globalization, and then also his myth of the Bronze Age chief, co-authored with Joanna Brooke, in the Oxford Handbook of European Prehistory, which sort of untangles really these very ingrained presumptions surrounding the correlations between prestige goods, power, and personhood. Last but not least, apart from his very prolific desk-based research, David Fontijn is also very active in the field. He directed key excavations, for example, at the Twin Barrows in Apeldoorn, and the spectacular Hallstatt Barrow at Oost-Zevenbergen, which were published. The latter was published in his 2013 volume, Transformation Through Destruction. But I think on this note, since we touch on fieldwork, I stop my introduction because I think we're touching here on territory which you might discuss tonight. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming David Fontijn. Thank you.
So, now, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. It's a pleasure and honor to be here. I just understood that my talk will be the same day as the State of the Union, but the title has nothing to do with it. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let me take you back to 4,000 years ago, and we cross the Atlantic and we go to Europe, to a period that we call the Bronze Age. And that's a period in which people lived in small-scale, semi-egalitarian societies. Everywhere in Europe, people were self-sufficient, they were full-time farmers, and they were making a living out of the land. They lived in hamlets, in massive longhouses with their cattle, and they buried their dead in burial mounds like these ones that we still find in huge numbers everywhere across Eurasia and Europe. There was no central leadership, there was no writing, there was no bureaucracy, and there was nothing that we can call a state. Now, in 1350 BC, one such a small local communities who lived in a peripheral area of northern Europe, you see that indicated here with the red dots, a locality was far from the major rivers, far from the sea. They received an object, the likes of it they must have never seen before. And that's this object. It was a giant bronze sword, this size, or rather an excessively oversized version of a sword of outstanding craftsmanship that was unparalleled in the region and even in Europe as a whole. And it's a bizarre object, not only because it's twice as big as common swords from this period, but also because it was never used as such. You should know that normally there would be a grip, a wooden grip over here, but as you see there are no rivets or notches, nothing to detach it. And you can maybe also see from this picture that the edges of the sword were never sharpened. As a matter of fact, by its very design, it couldn't even have been used. It is way too thin and way too big to handle. But what is particularly revealing, it's an outstanding piece of craftsmanship. Now, if we realize that something like this was cast in a primitive manner, and using a two-piece mold, barely polished, it is astonishing to see how refined the decoration is and how perfect the symmetry. Look at this edge, how beautifully it was made. Without any doubt, this is a masterpiece of bronze casting in Bronze Age Europe as a whole. So this must have been an extremely rare ceremonial object of the first order that was probably made by a mastersmith who lived somewhere far away from where the sword was found. Probably in northwest France or in South Britain, at least hundreds of miles away from the place where it was found. So this ceremonial object must have traveled over vast distances, probably by some form of gift exchange, before it ended up in this peripheral place in what is now the northeast of the Netherlands. But once this local community had this extraordinary object in its possession, what did they do with it? They threw it away. They probably placed it on a platform and let it sink down to the bottom of a dark peat bog. And that's a location from which it is almost impossible to ever retrieve it again. So try to think this. Perhaps one of the most special and valuable objects this society could ever hope to possess was deliberately and permanently given up. We would say it was destroyed. Now, bizarre as this may sound, what happened with this ceremonial sword was not a one-off. Almost everywhere in Europe, for a period of more than 1500 years, Bronze Age communities consigned massive amounts of metalwork to the ground. In the course of time, 10,000s or perhaps even hundreds of thousands of bronze and gold objects were buried in the ground and never taken out. Hundreds and hundreds of swords have been found in European rivers, like in the River Thames in London or in the River Rhine. And in one case, in a place in northwest France called Mort de Bretagne, in one action, no less than 4,000 bronze axe heads were buried in the landscape in one magnificent action. Now, a ceremonial object, like I just showed you, is what we would call wealth. And as we all know, wealth is key to power. Accumulating wealth, scarce things that are in high demand and therewith valuable, makes its owner influential, and it helps her or him to exert power onto other people. But how can a society function when it systematically destroys wealth at a massive scale? Now, making sense of this puzzling economy of destruction will be the topic of my talk. And my argument will be that we can only understand such destructive practices if we accept that objects are not merely things, but they have some sort of agency of their own. They do something with people, and they do something with the landscape. But let me start by just giving you some background information. One of the most crucial and disruptive innovations in the history of humanity is the transition from stone to metal. In the second millennium BC, people everywhere in Europe started to use the copper alloy bronze, and that is 90% copper and 10% tin, the perfect mix. And it was used for making everything, ranging from crucial tools like axes and sickles to social paraphernalia like ornaments, to weapons, and to ceremonial objects of the first order. And there are many reasons to do that. Tin bronze leads to stronger and sharper tools, but as this is also a material that has to be cast in molds, it also allows one to produce an entirely new range of objects that is impossible to make out of stone. Like, for example, swords. There is no way that you can make a sword out of stone or flint. And a crucial point is also that metal, like bronze or gold, are the first materials that are 100% recyclable. In this room, there will be copper that may have been already in circulation for hundreds of years. The thing is that you can remelt copper indefinitely, and this means that the Bronze Age really heralds the first circular economy in history. And this has profound consequences for the management of value. Suppose that you have a sword like this one, that is unique, almost ceremonial sword. And for one reason or another, you want to get rid of it. So you break it up and you throw it in a melting pot. And then you transform it into, well, for example, 8 generic bracelets. If you only have these bracelets, there is no way that you can see something of his previous history. You cannot see from looking at the bracelet that it once started his life as this unique work of art. So the entire notion of remelting things adds a new dimension to the conversion of valuable things and transformation. Something that really does not exist if you use materials that you cannot melt down, like stone. If you have a piece of stone, you can always see something by the first look of it. You can see where it came from, what it looked like, and maybe you can even see the traces of where it was formerly used for. Now, this shift from stone to metal also has profound social consequences. In this map, you see a simplified picture where you see in the brown zones where copper and tin ores were available in prehistory. And you see something very interesting, because if you realize that all the communities in Europe and Eurasia now entirely relied on bronze, you probably also see the problem that they have. This is a problem that was already realized by the famous archaeologist Gordon Child. Everywhere in Europe, people systematically gave up their independence. People in Denmark and Sweden came to rely entirely on metal sources that were more than 1,000 miles away, which means that for the first time in history, Europe and Eurasia really came to be connected and linked by huge pan-European trade networks in metal. So the need for bronze created an interdependency that was unseen before in history. And for that reasons, scholars have argued that the Bronze Age may have been the first period in our history that has some of the traits of globalization, even though it's of course not about the entire globe. So bronze was extremely important to people. It was not the objects that were made out of it, but in many parts of Europe, it was a scarce resource. And some people say it was a bit like oil is today. Now, so we can see the Bronze Age, an age of technological progress. It had the first circular economy, and it also has some of the traits of globalization. And for that reason, we often see it as the first period in prehistory we feel some familiarity with. But it also has a profound unfamiliar side. Because once prehistoric people had these scarce and crucial metals, what did they do with them? As I said before, they threw it away. Everywhere in Europe, enormous amounts of valuable metal was placed in landscape, in rivers, in mountains, in peat bogs, in burial mounds, and it was never taken out again. And how are we to make sense of that? Now, the problem is, of course, these are illiterate people. They did not write down their motivations. And it's also impossible for us as archaeologists to get into their head. So we do not know what they were thinking. But we can observe what they were doing. And the why is a bit in the how. Because the crucial thing is that we discovered that there is a rigid system behind this destructive behavior. When prehistoric people consigned metal objects to the landscape, they didn't do it randomly. To use a Shakespearean expression, there is a system behind the madness. It turns out that specific kinds of objects were only deposited at specific kinds of places. For example, in Western Europe, swords were apparently preferably deposited in major rivers like the River Rhine. Axes, on the other hand, tend to be deposited in small peat bogs, often close to the settlements, whereas simple local ornaments were used to adorn the deceased in burial mounds, in their graves. And I also have to assure you that decades of research have convincingly shown that we are not dealing with metal that was lost by accident, and it is also very unlikely that it represents material that people were temporarily hiding in the landscape but forgetting where they put it, so it is not what we see. It is very patterned behavior and it goes on for almost 2 millennia. So, a conclusion that seems to defy our modern economic theories then remains the only explanation available. These massive numbers of bronze and gold objects that are buried in the landscape ended up there because Bronze Age people deliberately gave them up and buried them in the landscape forever. So, everywhere in Europe, over a huge period, more than 1500 years, it was not just one random destruction of wealth, bronze and gold, but there is a rigid system behind it. Specific objects ending up in specific kind of natural places. Because interestingly, everywhere in Europe, these tend to be natural places, by which I mean that they were locations that were not altered by human hands. Rivers, peat bogs, caves, the tops of mountains, many other places. So this is very interesting because apparently such locations were seen to have be imbued with some kind of identity. Perhaps they were associated with divinities or ancestral powers or mainly more anonymous values. We don't know. But the thing is, it is certainly not something that matches up with what we know from later historical period, like the Greek or the Roman periods, where we do have the historical sources on gods. So we really have to do with the patterns in their behavior. The thing is, at least, that they were usually not buried in humanly built cult places like temples. Something like that did not exist in this period. So this implies, and that is very interesting, this implies that we are dealing with depositional practices that primarily function to impress onlookers, probably by the power of the performance. So when the performance, the deposition of this thing was over, when it ended up in the landscape and the object had disappeared, there was only memory. There was no lasting architectural marker to remind people that once a particular spectacular sacrifice took place at this location. And this is something that implies three things. First of all, objects were not just things. To prehistoric people, specific bronze objects apparently were seen to be imbued with an added social and cultural significance. A sword and a bracelet were both made out of prestigious, scarce metal bronze, right? But that's not all, because when they were buried in the landscape, they were buried separately, and that is consistent. So they were treated completely differently. Second point, this kind of depositional patterns also means that the landscape itself was not just nature in our sense, but the landscape must have been envisioned as being highly meaningful. A river and a peat bog both are wet places to us, but people sacrificed or deposited different things in rivers than they did in peat bogs. So apparently to prehistoric people, rivers on the one hand and peat bogs on the other may have had different cultural meanings, right? And third, it was primarily the quality of the practice itself that mattered here. Apparently it was important to destroy things in a particular way, in a particular place. Now, the fact that metal valuables were systematically destroyed or sacrificed in such a selective manner implies they were seen as imbued with social and cultural meaning. And in that sense, they were a bit like humans, in the sense that one cannot do just everything with them. They require a specific treatment. Now the question, of course, is how on earth is it possible that material that starts its life as generic, ordinary metal, taken out of a mine or acquired in straightforward economic trade, how is it possible that it ends its life as a singular cultural object? Now, key is that for an object to acquire special meaning, a number of conditions apparently had to be met. In order to function in a human world and to be able to fulfill a role as a valuable in society, it's important that an object first has what I call the right appearance. But, and that's the second point, it also got to have followed a certain social trajectory in society. What the culture in question considers to be the right or appropriate cultural biography, to use Igor Kopitov's term, the right life. But in prehistoric Europe, for an object to be consigned in the landscape, it apparently was also important that it had what we could call the right ending. And by this I mean that objects were not just buried in the landscape in an arbitrary way, but rather that the entire deposition could have been a performance in itself that created value and meaning. I will now give you some examples. Now, one of the reasons that metal is a true game changer is that it is a material resource and a valuable item at the same time. Unlike stone, metal lacks the visual properties that inform people on where it came from. If you have different kinds of stones, even by just looking at it, you can usually say where it comes from. But every copper object, regardless whether it comes from America or Europe, it simply looks the same. And this is important because it means then that what people do with it, the shape they give it, its appearance, that is everything. And that's in the hands of people. So appearance matters. Objects can have many shapes, but in order to fulfill certain roles, objects apparently got to have the right shape. And that is where cultural values intersect economy. Now what you see here is a serially produced ring. It's about this size, and they appear in massive numbers in hordes in Central Europe. And they are the first items in Europe that were really produced in highly standardized shape and weight. And for this reason, it has been argued that they must have functioned as some kind of standardized currency in social and economic transactions between people from far-flung regions. Now, currency, in principle, could have any shape. But it's very interesting to see that these objects mimic the shape of a neck ring. In this same region, such neck rings were initially really used and worn on the body, particularly by females. So they were embodied constituents of specific personal identities. People became different social personae by wearing them. And it's very interesting to see that something that got to function as an economic valuable, in its shape, immediately refers to what must have been an important cultural valuable. So for something to fulfill the role of currency in economic transactions, there nevertheless should have been a link to a higher cultural value as well. And this may sound a little bit strange, but actually it's not. We also have that on the dollar, reference to national symbols, to permanent, inalienable symbols, and references to God on something that you can use to buy everything. And about having the right shape, I come back to this fantastic find. To be sure, this is a masterpiece, but it is not just some masterpiece. It has a very distinctive shape. Probably around 1350 BC, somewhere in France, a master smith made 6 highly similar sacred ceremonial swords of outstanding quality. The interesting thing is that when you study them, they are extremely similar. But, and we know that for a fact, they were not made in the same mold, so they are not copies. So you cannot make one without having seen the other. You really should have it by your side, otherwise it's impossible to make one. So apparently it was very important to these people that these swords mimicked each other into the smallest details. So they really seem to have been made as, well, a family of, let's call it, sacred swords. But that's not all, because they also refer in their shape to normal swords that we have in huge numbers. They seem to have been made as some kind of abstractions or idealizations or aggrandized versions of normal sorts. They look like them, but they are perfect. They look like them, but they are bigger, they are more beautiful. And there is a sense of abstraction to them that, according to the anthropologist Maurice Godelier, helps to perceive such items as embodying the key values of society. In this case, probably an ideology of warriorhood. So here we see how things help to make abstract concept thinkable. Things need to have a particular appearance in order to play a specific social role, no matter whether they are simple, basic currency or high order cultural valuables. Another reason why certain things may be perceived as fits for being placed in a landscape is because they were used. It's a pattern that many of the things that we find in the landscape really have seen an intensive use life. And that reminds me of what the anthropologist Kopitief calls the right cultural biography. Of the thousands of the objects that were sacrificed in the Bronze Age landscape, most of them indeed were used. And this sword that you see here, for example, you can see it a little bit, has been resharpened. There are cutting edges on it. So was really used in battle. And we know that it was finally deposited in a river. And actually, in a way, that's not so strange, because by being used, the thing itself gets inextricably linked to the people who use it, right? It becomes entangled with the history of people, and in that way also acquires social value. And that's even more clear when it comes to objects that are inextricably linked to people's appearances. Because body ornaments were a very important part of the metalwork that we find in the landscape. In the Bronze Age, people literally covered themselves with lavish and ostentatious bronze and gold ornaments, which signaled specific social statuses. Here you see an example. You see very big fibulae on the right that were used to fasten cloaks. There are pins, there are bracelets, and these are elements of necklaces. Were all found together. So in the Bronze Age, there were sets of body ornaments, perhaps even entire costumes, and that only a small group of females wore. And it is intriguing to see that such ornaments were usually made in a supra-regional style, a style which contrasts markedly with the ornaments worn in the local community. So by wearing it, these women not only attained an important social identity, but by wearing such rare but super-regionally styled body ornaments, they also seem to have claimed membership of what Benedict Anderson calls imagined communities. Even though these women may have never met before, when they would have met, by the costumes and by the ornaments that they wore, they would have recognized that they both had important social roles in their respective communities. So in order to fulfill specific social roles, things ought to have a particular appearance, but apparently also ought to have led a particular kind of life. But that life, in the end, came to an end at a certain moment. And the crucial thing is that, let me sure about that, the largest part of the bronze and the gold objects indeed ended up here in the melting pot. It was recycled again. Models show that probably 85% of the bronze was remelted. But an important part, and this is where it gets bizarre because we're talking about large amounts of objects, was not recycled, but it was deliberately removed from society. It was buried in the landscape or engraved and never taken out again until archaeologists found it thousands of years later. And as we have seen, that process of burial was done in a very specific way. For example, objects were often not just buried, but they were physically transformed. Here you see a sword that has been bent, and you can also see here that they have been hacking on it. And this hacking is not caused by battle damage, but it's really hacking that you only can get if you really are hacking it like this. So it seems a little bit like they have been killing this sword, maybe to emphasize that its use life was terminated. And objects were also often deposited in a specific ordering. Things were placed in circles. Swords were placed in an upright position in the landscape. And there were apparently conventions about associations and dissociations between objects. Certain objects apparently could only be associated with other objects. For example, in Western Europe, weapons and local ornaments rarely seem to have been deposited together. And we have very good evidence that specific ornaments and weapons were used to adorn the body of the dead. Here you see, for example, daggers in the left and gold hair clips, which are very often found in graves. And on the other side, you see halberds, which is another kind of weapon, and you see gold lunulae. Lunulae are some kind of golden necklaces. So they were used, weapons were used, and they were worn on the body, but the latter category never is to be found on the bodies of the dead. So apparently it was not meant to be there, but they were buried in the landscape instead. Now, letting a gold glimmering, exceptional bronze object sink down in a dark peat bog must have been an act of dramatic proportions. It must have been an act that was meaningful in itself. But intriguingly, it was captivating precisely because of this drama. Because when it was over, there was no monument, there was no marker, there was only the remaining eternal peat bog. And the only thing that remained were memory traces. As Mike Rowlands once put it when he discussed this kind of practices, such acts work to create a memory in its absence, and therefore, and therewith, they become the essence of what has to be remembered. So, what happened in the Bronze Age is that wealth or things that gave status or were meaningful were not simply accumulated by powerful people. No, maybe they've done that, but at least a part of it was systematically given up. It was sacrificed, deposited, whatever you would like to call it. And perhaps it was perceived as a way of sharing the things that matter with the long-term sphere of society, as Maurice Bloch calls it, by being ritually placed in the landscape forever. But it also implies that, to quote the anthropologist Simon Harrison, identity, personal identity, is something that can be worn, but also can be shed. The paraphernalia, the bronze ornaments, gave this Bronze Age woman her status. But in some cases, these ornaments were taken off. They were surrendered, probably meaning that the identity it signaled was seen as dissolved. And perhaps the entire process was seen as giving something back to the eternal landscape that is always there and that surrounds the people. This at least means that identity was not permanently fixed with one particular individual. It was something that was shared. It was relational. So, objects make people. And this implies that what you do with the objects also affects people. And this makes sense of something that we see in the evidence very often. Objects signaling identity, like this hypothetical bracelet, in the Bronze Age were often broken, and they were found in broken and, importantly, in incomplete state. So, before they were buried in the landscape, people apparently deliberately broke the object and they only buried a part of it. Now, this implies that the thing that denotes a certain personhood was shared and distributed over different contexts. One part was sacrificed in the landscape or buried with the ancestor in a grave, and the other part kept on circulating in society, therewith in a way linking the supernatural or ancestral beings or whatever you would like to call it, associated with the burials and the landscape to the people who were still living. So, if objects are implemental in imbuing people with a certain identity, The literal sharing of objects also implies that identities were seen as shared and relational. They were distributed between these different high status women that wear them, but also between the entities or whatever it was perceived that were supposed to be in the landscape where these ornaments were placed in. So, yeah, ladies and gentlemen, what I've seen here tonight is that people who lived in prehistoric Europe time and again gave up a part of scarce and crucial materials. And that is strange to us because it seems to defy a certain kind of economic rationality that we are familiar with. But if people were doing this everywhere in Europe thousands of times over a period of more than 1500 years, it cannot have been irrational. We know for a fact that they did have what we would call a rational circular economy, based on the circulation of metal, recycling of metal. But apparently it was also important for them, from time to time, that they had to give up something of their wealth. And the way in which it was done, as a ritual performance, implies that it may have been envisioned as giving something back to the permanent cultural or spiritual sphere of society. And it very much seemed that the natural landscape was perceived as its recipient. So, a purely political economic sphere in which things have pure economic and trade value and are alienable and exchangeable has to be linked to what Maurice Bloch and Perry have called a long-term sphere of shared cultural values where things are inalienable. So what some anthropologists have called a moral economy. So a political economy always has to be linked to a moral economy. In order to achieve something, a society has to give things up. And actually, this is something that we also know from our own modern society. For example, when Bronze Age people deposited valuables in the landscape, they may have had some belief on what they could achieve for themselves by doing this. But in all fairness, they did not have any control on the outcome, whether the good harvest or the success in warfare really resulted from that deposition or sacrifice is purely a matter of belief. Some of us, and I had to think of this a couple of days ago, some of us may go to the supermarket and we buy biological foods. So actually we also sacrifice a little bit of our wealth for a bigger common goal of society. And we as individuals also do not know the exact results of our buying, the result of our buying biological food is. But apparently it feels as something that we have to do. It's a moral act. And what about charity? The famous example, of course, but the author of Harry Potter, Rowling, she gave so much of her fortune to charity that she lost her billionaire status. However, as you will see if you surf the internet, her moral status has skyrocketed simply because of that. But if society feels that you are not doing that, it could also affect your moral status, but then in a negative way. And allegedly, this seems to be the case with the billionaire that is now doing the State of the Union. So, our own economy is, of course, an extreme case, but the anthropologists Bloch and Perry have argued that every society needs a short-term sphere where things can be alienated, can be acquired, can be traded, can be changed hands. But at the same time, every society also needs a long-term sphere of social value, of morals, and cultural ideas, things that are to be kept, and both have to be connected. And I think this is a little bit what happens in the Bronze Age, when some objects and materials acquired through trade were permanently given up and buried in the landscape forever. So from a short-term perspective, this looks to us like destruction. But we also have seen there were ritualized practices by which it was done. Things were not arbitrarily destroyed, but there were strict conventions and treatments. And they got to have the right shape, they got to have the right life, they were often physically transformed. And this is a way to make these objects special, to link them to the moral and social values of the society in question, in a way to shield them and make them permanent. Let us go back to the magnificent object that I started my talk with. Now, a ceremonial object like this one came to a prehistoric local community from very far away. As such, it almost symbolized the dependency of this local community on a much more encompassing world. Globalized history is often the history of traveling objects, because traveling objects are the most tangible evidence of worlds beyond the horizons for people who do not have maps or cannot write or read. As Mary Helms has put it, for people without text and writing, it is objects from far-flung places that tell these people about the existence of far-flung places and far-flung peoples. Now, when an object like this one reached the Ommerschans community, it was this thing that told them about other people who lived very far away. And because the object was so special, perhaps, this is of course speculation, perhaps they even believed that it was made by suprahuman beings. But at least we can say that such an otherworldly object always has to be realigned with what Bloch and Perry call the local order and the local values at home. And I think this is also what happens in this case. The object that stands out for a craftsmanship that was unparalleled in the region where it ended up. But when it was deposited, it was buried in a small peat bog, perhaps the most lasting and unaltered, intimate part of the local environment. And this precious object was deposited together with a range of the most simple and down-to-earth tools, like intensively used chisels that you see here to the left, probably used for woodworking, very modest flint tools on top here. So in a way, maybe reconciling the sublime high order symbolized by the sword to the down-to-earth nature of the tools of normal local farmers' life. So they appropriated this strange, sacred, foreign thing by associating it with humble local things, as if the entire assemblage were a map of their worlds. And altogether, they let it sink down to the bottom of a peat bog, making it permanently out of reach forever and making it permanent part of their landscape, until more than 3,000 years later, it was found by us. So people created value by destroying valuables. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. After your comments on the dear leader, I hope they'll let you go again after your trip to the US. Do we have questions? Start off.
I'm sure this is the first thing that a lot of people who are not in archaeology ask, but do we know, even though it happened over such a long period of time, do we know if it was related to warfare or invaders or?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. Well, I'm talking about, I have been talking about it in a little bit simplified way because there are many things happening. And one major theme that's very important is what they did with weaponry. And weapons that were deposited, as I said, were often indeed used. So they were used to kill people. And fascinating thing is, of course, that sometimes large numbers of weapons were placed in the landscape. So then you have a very interesting event, because weapons were made to kill people, they were used to kill people, probably used in battle, but afterwards, apparently, maybe because they were seen as polluted or whatever, they were also removed from society, and maybe a little bit also leveling out the differences between people. But this is a very important theme in these practices, which can be seen in particular regions in Europe. So yes, I think in an important way. It has to do with warfare, but also with warfare as an ideal, or as a maybe supernatural value. Like, for example, the fact that ceremonial objects takes the shape of a sword. I hope it's an answer to your question.
Please. Deborah.
Thank you, that was fascinating. And this is another question that's probably really obvious, but so you presented a view of the society that everybody would agree that taking valuable objects and putting them in a bog would create social value. In any society, there are deviants, and what is to have stopped people from going back the day after a burial? Perhaps there was some ritual, it probably wasn't private, right? And digging it up and taking it for themselves.
Yeah.
So, I mean, obviously some of these things are still there, but you found it 3,000 years later. Presumably somebody could have found it the next day pretty easily.
No, I like this question. The thing is, if that would be the regular practice, then actually the result is that we wouldn't find anything, because they just simply retrieved it. I think these people were not stupid. They probably could get it out many times. Of course, not in a peat bog or in a river, but in the dry landscape. You can imagine that it's possible. As a matter of fact, in the book that I wrote, I paid a lot of attention to it, because I think that this is a practice that probably took place a lot of times. And things were temporarily consigned to the landscape, also in a ritualized way, and later taken out again. The problem with that view is that I cannot prove it, because there is no evidence of it, because the only evidence I have is of those objects that were left. So, by a number of points that you can start to make an assumption from, you think this must have been one of the things that people were doing, and probably even in a ritualized way. But what we see is actually those cases where they didn't take it out. So apparently it may have been intentional that it would remain there. And then I talked about those models, how much actually this represents, with loads and loads of objects, but in terms of percentages, I think this is something like 15% of less perhaps. So in reality, most of it probably was simply taken out and recycled. I hope there's an answer. It's a difficult question.
I mean, we know grave robbing is something that happened also, and that's that was one of the contexts for burial that you outlined. So people didn't have a problem, stealing something from
That's a good thing. Grave robbing is for other periods very well known. For example, early medieval period in Europe, it's very well known. It was a regular practice. Actually, for the Bronze Age, we don't have that much evidence for it. Actually, we hardly have any evidence. And intriguingly, even grave robbing, we call it robbing, but if it took place in the Bronze Age, it can also be a way that they took it out and had it in circulation again, because some of our deposits contain very old objects. And of course, I don't know their previous history, but it's very well possible that they have been simply found by people and entered circulation again as some sort of relic or token.
Thanks. I have a kind of follow-on question, which is primarily motivated by the fact that I'm a cultural anthropologist. I work with the people who potlatch, and I'm surprised that potlatch didn't come up as a kind of analytical model. But I was thinking about the kind of classic literature on the potlatch, and I saw that Mose was there in your sort of credits at the very end. And I've been thinking about not so much the ethnographic literature on potlatch, but the kind of theoretical literature that drew on that. People like Mose, people like Veblen, and who worked the kind of destruction, the conspicuous destruction of property into a kind of theory of circulation along the lines that you developed. And I have just two questions about that. One is that it turns out that a lot of the ethnographic data about potlatch was radically dehistoricized, so that the destruction of property was not actually as intrinsic to the potlatch as an economic system on the coast, as a lot of those initial theorists thought, that it was really about a byproduct of a particular colonial moment in which social and spiritual systems were in disarray, so that rather than naturalizing destruction as a kind of key part of the cosmology, it represented a historical anomaly. And thinking about along that, I mean, this happened over a much longer period of time from what you showed. But thinking about that, my first question is there a danger of overgeneralizing the destructive aspect, which, even though we see it frequently, as being a kind of hallmark of a more standardized, widespread cosmology or economy? Or might it have really been the province of some element of society at some moment of time, and had value particularly because of that, because it was perceived at the time as strange? Then but the second part of my question is exactly the opposite direction, which is the more evidence we find in history across cultures of this practice, at some point do we have to stop asking, why do people do this strange thing, and instead defamiliarize the radical Protestant ethic of not doing this? I mean, like, so there's sort of two questions. Is it as unusual as we think, and if not, what's the typical?
Okay, fantastic. I will start with the last one. Yeah, I deliberately used the term economy, which is of course a highly charged term, but I did it because I think if you look, there is a literature of 150 years about this topic, and the people hyping, how is it possible that they were doing this? And actually, there's almost like a stalemate. There's not that much progress being made because this problem, what we see as a problem, actually comes from a quite particular perspective on economy. And that's what I think you are referring to. That's why I deliberately also call it economy of destruction, because if you look at it that way, it can be actually seen that this economy was, for a very important part, about giving things up, about sharing, and there's also a way we can look at the economy. So my intention was to really go to what the deep history of, in this case, Europe, can tell us actually about economy. If we start from an economic question, and we see things that do not match, and we see some sort of patterning in it, and what they were doing, we really have some grips to that. And actually, we have also a view on economy, which end up different than what we started with. And I think it's interesting because nowadays there are a lot of discussions about the moral limits of markets and all these sort of things, of course, also inherent to what I talked about today. But for these people, apparently it was not a problem. This is what they did. And of course, your first point is fantastic. I'm enormously interested in the topic, so I really would like to hear more about that later. I deliberately avoid using the term here, and actually for the reason that it would be very unfair to the people practicing potlatch, I think, if I would be doing it, because I am aware of what you said, and particularly because the potlatch has been also really been abused as an analogy for Bronze Age, because they say, yeah, this is like potlatch, and they took out this very conspicuous consumption variety of the potlatch, and just throw it over Europe and say, actually, this is what happens. My approach has been to go back to the evidence we have, and of course there are thousands of things that we don't know. We have to be honest about that. But there are a number of very strong patterns which are widely shared, and they are very consistent and persistent over time. So 1500 years, but we can also extend it back into the Neolithic when they do similar things, so even much longer. So we cannot really use one very specifically historically situated analogy, fantastic as it is, to explain something from such a broad range. So my approach really has been to go back through the evidence and build it again. And about the element of destruction, I think it is overemphasized. I also provocatively in title, because I think for these people it was not destruction. It's destruction to us, but for them it may be making it permanent by placing in the landscape that perhaps would fit much better what they were doing. We cannot ask them anymore, but I think we can gain a lot from see what they were doing, and that's interesting in itself. So, but maybe we have some more time to talk about it later. I would be very pleased.
The ceremonial sword that you started with, when you took it back, as it were, to the master craftsman who made it, you said this craftsman made 7. How do we know?
Yeah, there are 6. There are 6 found in Europe. 6.
And then again?
There are 6 of these swords found in Europe. It's of course theoretically possible that there were more, but the thing is that the quality is so extremely high that it is not that likely that that someone has been able to make them in some sort of line of production or so. The interesting thing is that it has been studied by many people from different countries, and later they started to say, actually, I have exactly the same things. And there was one moment when they all came together in an exhibition for the first time since the Bronze Age, probably. So it's also very funny. And then, because everybody said, yeah, it must be serial production.
Where was the exhibition?
Sorry?
Where was
There was an exhibition in the National Museum of Antiquities in Leiden, in Holland. And that was the first moment that they were all together. And then a group of scholars from the different countries where they came from were able to study them. And we saw, well, they are very, very similar, but they're not the same. And it's impossible that they were made in the same mold, for example. But the quality and the some sort of details in the craftsmanship was there was a number of very specific things being done that, yeah, seemed to be like the mark of a master. We're still working on that, but I think it gives us some ground to say that they were probably made by one person or one workshop in one time. And the fascinating thing is that later on they were distributed across Europe. 2 ended up in England, 2 ended up in France, 2 ended up in the Netherlands. And also in the same way, when we have the contact, we know that they were all ending up in peat bogs. Without them, I think the local community who were doing it didn't probably know that, but that's also very interesting. Yeah, it's amazing stuff.
With regard to the question, can I ask you, you used the term globalization several times, and I felt maybe there was a sort of a tension. On the one hand, you spoke about objects being used to create a similar type of person in different places, but on the other hand, you used also objects or referred to objects that were used in the sense of Mary Helms to structure landscapes and actually to create distance, which would be not very what we understand usually as the translocal notion of time and space, of the compression, what we understand of the globalization. How does this play out with specific types of object?
Yeah, that's a difficult topic. Though, if you start by the idea that in the case of metal, bronze that you can cast, you can give the object any shape. The interesting thing is that if you just look at all the possibilities they had and you see what they actually made, then they have been very, very much focusing on a very limited number of shapes. Probably the shape was telling something about, for example, the network, the circulation network where the thing came from. And now, interestingly, you also have like regional production that actually still in shape and style very much matches the broader productions. So maybe it was seen as something that you can convert from one sphere to another or so. So now the thing is that, for example, there are axes that have been made in England and axes that have been made in France, but in terms of their appearance, they look the same. Actually, if you just have them on your table, you can't say this one was made in England, this was made in France. So if you now try to imagine that there's a community who receive these objects, they probably will not have a concept of like England being an island on the other end of the North Sea from the continent. But they will probably see, yeah, it's come from this network, and that network is, well, it's somewhere in the south. Yeah. And it doesn't really matter how, sometimes they have this knowledge, but many times it doesn't really matter as long as it works. Apparently, the thing is that they have really been playing with the appearances of objects. They have to fit styles or really be very different. And well, how it exactly work, I don't know in detail yet. But what we see, for example, in practice, we see that there are things coming from different sort of regions, like from the north, from the south. But when they are all the same sort of object, all axes, for example. When they were deposited, they were taken apart. So, like Nordic axes coming from Denmark were not placed together with French axes, even though the people had them both. But when they were probably separated on geography, on where they came from. In other cases, like French and English axes in the Netherlands, they were always deposited together. So apparently French and English is one common category for them. It's not a problem to mix them. Right. So this is very confusing. I've been playing with the term of maybe some sort of brands, in the sense that it gives you an idea, okay, it looks like this, it comes from this network, we know the people, we have connections, it's our own world. And this stuff is comes from something else. Right. And maybe that also has consequence for how it was used. This is maybe not a good answer to your question, but it's something that is there in the patterns of deposition, I think.
Yeah. Sure. Separate.
Thank you for your talk. It was really interesting. I was happy to hear you complicate your use of the term destruction in the Q&A. I mean, it strikes me that that beautiful sword, the one of the sex, if we took that and melted it down, that would be regarded as a form of destruction of that object, right? I mean, so there's a kind of irony in saying that preserving the form of the object and placing it in the ground is an act of destruction, whereas melting it down wouldn't be an act of destruction. Certainly, melting it down from our perspective today would be regarding it as an extreme act of destruction. So the other models for thinking about that, whether gift giving or offering, I would be interested in hearing more of your thoughts on. But there was one moment where you mentioned that some objects seem to have been abused before they went into the ground. I mean, that's extraordinary to me, in the sense that it seems very, very different than taking a singular object that of high craftsmanship, placed, never used, into the ground, versus another object that might have been bent and aggressed in some way. Surely there's some significant difference there in the biographies of those objects at that final moment. So maybe you could comment on that as well.
Yeah, no, that is, I think that there is really a difference there. Going back to the beginning, destruction, well, from a short-term perspective, scarce material, scarce resource that you don't have yourself, that you can recycle, and the entire economy that they were having in short-term economy was based on recycling material. So if you bury something in the ground and you leave it there, it comes down to destruction of a valuable resource. In that sense, you can also call it destruction. This has been called like that in the literature. But there is indeed something where objects themselves were physically transformed. And the term destruction to us has a very negative connotation, I think. But there is a pattern that some objects in the same moment were not having this treatment and others were. And there must be something going on there. And this is not something that is something that is the same in every region, but in the region where that sword came from that I showed you, that it's so bent, the common biography for things ending up like swords in the ground is that they were complete. So they were placed in rivers or walks in sharpened conditions and not broken or whatever. So this is an exception. And actually, and that's interesting, if you look at that sword and the style of it, it's a very strange thing. It's actually a one-off in terms of the decoration. There is some sort of probably glass inserted into it. So in that sense, it is really a one-off in what it looks like, but also in its biography of how it was made with decoration and so on. I don't know, of course, but it could be that this is one of the reasons why this object was really physically, killed, if you would like to use that word, and others are not. So it really means, it must mean something, I think. But unfortunately, I think we should start on the patterns that we have and see how much comes out of it. But there are things going on there. But at this moment, we are testing out this sort of thing, so I can't really give you all the answers to that sort of questions, unfortunately.
Michael?
You mentioned these things as being recyclable, but you need a lot of heat and a big furnace in order to melt down these things. How prevalent were these among these communities that were considering these recyclable things?
No, I'm not skilled in this myself, but actually you can actually remelt metal in a rather simple way, and we have a number of people who are doing experiments for us in this, showing us how it could have been done. Actually, what you see then is that most of it's not that difficult. Of course, there are differences in skill involved, but it is something that could really be done with the techniques that they had. And if you consider all the regional styles and all the optics and casting modes that you have, they probably did it. We don't have that much evidence of production places themselves, but the reason is probably because they were very simple. They were usually like small pits in the ground where they made a simple furnace, and apparently it works. But we don't have that much evidence of it. That is indeed true.
Deborah?
I have another question, I'm sorry. So just a slightly different direction. You talked only about metal work, and you made this distinction between local and something that came from another place. And I wonder whether there's any evidence of people with ritually burying anything of ceramic or any other material, because obviously that's another something else that they had.
Yeah, no, that is a very good question. Actually, you can really think of different spheres of, well, let's call it valuables, things that matter to people. And when it started before the Bronze Age, with in the Neolithic, and then you have also like important material, foreign material that was treated, but also pottery and ceramics, also of beads from different materials. So everything was there. The thing is that with metal, there is I sometimes call it like a metallization of deposition, because really metal becomes the thing. Actually, metal becomes the thing that is dominating all these spheres. There are still some deposition of pottery and other materials, but not that much as was before. So apparently, it was particularly the placing of metal in the ground that was very important. And if you look to later periods like the Iron Age, then you see that all the other materials come back again. Iron, all pottery, all sort of stone objects, they again also are being placed in landscape. So in this sense, what happened in this Bronze Age really was a bit historically unique. But they did do it, but not on the level that they did it before and after.
Sorry, yes.
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much, that was so interesting. I was really curious about what evidence there is for the performative aspect, other than like a ritual or a ceremony, other than the location of the swords. And the reason I ask is this reminded me of a really amazing talk by an archaeologist, Omar Harmanshah, who talks about ISIS and their destruction of incredibly valuable objects of cultural heritage around the Middle East. And his analysis was that what we are in the West describing as iconoclastic destruction is actually image creation.
Yeah.
They're making their power known by creating incredibly powerful images. So that like performative aspect.
Yeah.
I was just wondering what evidence there was for performance in ritual.
Yeah. No, I think this is also sort of a line that I follow. Though what we know about the performances is, of course, we only have the objects in the landscape and how they were placed, and we can trace some of his biographies. So there's many things that we simply don't know. So we must be honest about that. But actually, there's already quite a lot. And one of the things is that we see consistently everywhere in Europe that there were no, when it was done, there was nothing to mark the locations. But fascinatingly, you see that the same sort of locations were being revisited time and again. So apparently people had some memory of where it happened, and it was important to do it at the same place. So, and this comes back to some sort of practices where what you do can have such an impact on people because it's spectacular or all these performances that people really it's imprinted in their heads, and they know all the details about what not to do and what to do. And this is the sort of things it's the only way that they can reproduce it again, by memory. And there must have been some sort of stereotyping in it. And in a way in a new act, you are again reinventing it, you're redoing it again. So in that sense, I think really it's an act of creation, because what's in your head is the image of this object being so important that they dare to give it up and place it in a landscape, in their own landscape. This is very much like a thing that creates value, because it makes it's what the quote by Michael Rowlands actually said. It becomes a memory in its absence. His point, because it's no longer there, and it was done in such a fantastic way, such a dramatic way. It really sticks to your head how important it was and how it should be done. So I think it's really much like a creative act in that sense, and maybe very much on the line that you refer to in that ISIS case. I think there are many more examples all over the world where you see this sort of things happen. I think of Malangan in New Ireland by Susan Kugler, where you also have these this kind of practices where they make beautiful wood carvings out of memory, and then they have a ceremony with them. Then in the end, they appear to be placed in the woods and they rot away, or they are sold, but they are no longer there. So it's apparently also very much like a performative act that prints itself on people. Yes, I entirely agree.
I'm curious about the more recent historiography of some of these objects. I mean, particularly the 6 sacred swords, because that's such a resonant example. How have the histories that you've outlined of these objects kind of acting as indexes to both a kind of local identity and what you call a supra-regional identity, how do those map onto sort of more contemporary discourses around nationalism or internationalism or kind of European identity? I'm just curious if you see any.
That is fantastic.
How are these mobilized in contemporary?
Yeah, that's very nice. Well, that sword that I showed you, actually, there was a big chance that I couldn't have showed it to you, because it has already been lost until a couple of years ago. That was found in the 19th century. And it was a very long story that I will not bore you with, but in the end it could never be acquired by a museum. And something happened in the Second World War by which the owners of the thing so much started to hate the Dutch state that they never wanted to see anyone from that country again and to show these magnificent objects. So the thing is, what happens, there was a plaster cast of this object, and that's the only knowledge that we had about its existence. There was an archaeologist, an American archaeologist, who came to the Netherlands, and he found it, and he studied it, and he got an idea of what it was, and they tried to see the original object, which was impossible. And the thing is, in the environment where it was found, people also heard about his story, and they were very proud to have apparently some sort of big treasure was found. And I'm talking about the 1950s, and all this time, it was something that was talked about. It was there in the local folklore, and they made their own replicas. So it really like a token of something, although nobody has ever seen it. Even I published about this find without ever having seen it. So for me it was also like, it became a memory in its absence, because I never was able to study it. And then there came a moment that the curator of the museum finally approached people, and he could see it. And then they heard it was something special. Unfortunately, they decided to go to an auction, to Christie's, and there was a very big competition. And fortunately, in the end, the museum could acquire the object. And the funny thing is that it ended up in a completely economic transaction for hard money. Like, this is the most expensive archaeological object ever bought by a museum in my country. So. This is now known as the sword of 500,000 euro, which is very odd because, yeah, it's actually a reversal of what it was. But in a way, it's interesting to see that if you want to express cultural value, you still need money to put a number on it, although you say it's priceless. But and now it's there, we very much want to bring it back, and also back to the locality where it came from, because all this time the people have held the memory alive. And so for them it's very sad because the museum is very far from their homes, so they cannot have it, they cannot see it themselves. So it is now really turning a little bit in hiking, so there's a post stamp with it, and now there you can buy all sort of merchandise with the sword. So, well, we're working on that. But it's now really, yeah, well, not nationalism, but it's becoming some sort of symbol now. So yeah, there's an entire story to be told about that. And also very funny, many people see it as modern art, because there are artists who are not so much interested in history, but they say, wow, this is such an amazing design. This is brilliant, it's so modern. Although it is done for 3,000 years old, or more. But it is also the way that it looks, it's very, well, it's evocative. So yeah.
If there are no more questions, can I ask you one brief one? There was the mysterious figure of the master crafts person. If that person can make people, can make objects that make people, the figure of the craftsperson themselves was the one who made societies, who made cosmic things of cosmic significance. What kind of evidence or what kind of theories do we have surrounding the makers of these objects?
Yeah, well, actually there's been studies about skill and bronze casting by Michael Kuipers, a fantastic piece of work. And actually this kind of craftsmanship, this virtuoso level, the highest level, is actually very rare. And we actually do not know anything about the persons who were doing it, how they were situated also socially. And I think you know much more about it. I know from some of the coppers and the potlets there's been metallurgical research and showing that they were made from European coppers. Although the story is that people believe that they are given from gods or made from local stuff. So I don't know, of course, in this case, but I can imagine that here also there was some sort of transformation that the moment that these objects arrived in the far north, that they maybe have gotten some sort of mythical status because they came from so far and they look so special. But they must have been made by people. And I do think it must have taken place in a special social context, because it's not like, so I'm a little bit bored, so what shall I do? Oh, let's make some ceremonial swords. No, it is not, of course, how it works. But in all honesty, we lack evidence about that sort of things. But it's a very intriguing point, I think.
Thank you very much.